time. Yes, it's indeed time for The World This Week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour with us. Christopher Dickey of Newsweek and The Daily Beast. How are you, sir?
Fine, thank you.
Also with us, Marcus Mabry of the International Herald Tribune and the man responsible for all you find at ihtrendezvous.com. Thank you, sir, for being with us. And Elisabeth Moutet of the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Telegraph. And Stefan de Vries of Dutch broadcaster RTL4. Welcome, sir. The World This Week, you can, throughout the week, keep abreast of what's high on our minds on Facebook and also on Twitter. You can find us at FrancoisF24. The week began with Egypt counting votes in the country's first ever presidential election runoff, and news that whoever wins, well, it'll be the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces that'll write the winner's job description. This after dissolving parliament. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood claims its candidate, Mohamed Morsi, won the poll against Hosni Mubarak's last prime minister, Lieutenant General Ahmed Shafiq. This Friday, as you can see, Tahrir Square packed. Protesters there ahead of a result that's now expected for Saturday. At the same time, the SCAF warning in a statement on state television that it'll crack down if there's any trouble. It says, quote, the early release of the presidential election results before the announcement by the responsible body was unjustified and is one of the main reasons for divisions and tensions in the political arena. Egyptians, by the way, abridging the full SCAF statement into under 140 characters on Twitter. Here's what Mohammed El Dashan says. SCAF statement, respect our legitimacy because we have the guns, bitches. While Shams El Ghomeini says, SCAF new statement, the democracy you're calling is not available at the moment. Please never call back. This doesn't bode well for Saturday, does it, Chris?
No, if indeed the election results are announced on Saturday. And they were supposed to be announced on Thursday, then they were stalled, they're now stalled again. We don't know when those election results are going to be announced, and I think basically the military is trying to feel its way to a position where it can say, our guy won, Ahmed Shafiq, our candidate won, and minimize the violence. But I would say there's a very good chance that if the announcement is made tomorrow and they announce that it is not the Muslim Brotherhood candidate who appeared from all the polling stations to have won. Remember, it's not just that these are numbers that were floating around. This was a relatively transparent election until after the election. And you had people at all these polling stations counting the votes publicly. And those were being tweeted by the Muslim Brothers, among others. So people know what the election results were, and the Muslim Brothers won.
And by the way, there are some who've actually gone into the translation business on Twitter, like this account, which calls itself SCAF Egypt, but doesn't sound like it is. According to Article 15, Word 7, no one whose name rhymes with Corsi may become president. Jokes aside, though, wouldn't it be a smart move, Stefan de Vries, for the ruling military to let the Muslim Brotherhood win a presidency where they've basically given themselves the right to gut the prerogatives?
Yeah, it would be smart, considering the fact that if they don't win, the Muslim Brotherhood will become the underdog again, and then they can. That's one of the reasons of the success, not only in Egypt, but also in the other countries, that for a very long time the Muslim Brotherhood was a forbidden party, and it had the social structure to gain a lot of voters. And I think when you turn the Muslim Brotherhood again into a forbidden party or into a party that is clearly the underdog, then it will only serve the Muslim Brotherhood. So if they are really smart, as you said, then yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood, they should let them win. Although let them win, they probably have won. So yeah, that would be the smart thing to do.
And your prediction?
I'm not so sure what's going to happen.
And Elisabeth Moutet?
I have no predictions whatsoever, but the idea that they are, the military rule, the military structure is smart is an interesting posit, but I'm not sure it's true. I also think that they have bad habits. They've used the Muslim Brotherhood as a foil to stay in power. That was the Mubarak thing. And I wonder whether we're going to talk about the the ghost of Mubarak. Over
Well,
all this.
let's talk.
I think if I had to bet, I would bet that they will make the mistake of saying that their candidate won, and then the result is going to be exactly what one predicts. With it's going to be a confiscated revolution.
Now, you mentioned the ghost of Mubarak. For all we know, he's not dead; he's alive, and yet the reason that Elizabeth said that was that in the midst of all the tension of this week, our newsroom, like many, dropped everything when the Egyptian state news agency suddenly announced that Mubarak had slipped into a coma and was clinically dead. 12 hours later, the New York Times had a different version. What really happened, Mubarak's lawyer said, was that he'd suffered a fall in the prison bathroom, which resulted in a blood clot on his neck, and he'd been removed from the prison at 5 p.m., long before reports of his near-death experience began to appear. Marcus Mabry, why did that announcement come out?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer. It was the state media that first announced it, and so therefore a lot of people ran with it. We kept hedging our bets and saying that no one else is saying this. There's no confirmation. And then of course the lawyer came out with his statement. It'll be interesting to see. The lawyer said in the end he's actually quite well and will be with us for a while. It'll be interesting to see if that's true. And if he does endure for a while, and it's kind of, as we discussed this question of whether Morsi is going to be declared the winner or not, you wonder, which will live longer, the revolution or Mubarak. I kind of tend to think it'll be the revolution that'll live longer. It's looking back at the whole question of who they're going to allow to be the winner, who they're going to allow to be the president. Just last week we were all talking about these conspiracy theories and, they've already cut a deal with the Brotherhood to share power. And now all of a sudden we're saying, well, maybe, they're not as... The military leaders are not as smart as we thought they were last week. We thought they were actually, real practitioners of realpolitik. They were going to, hey, they worked out a deal before. Now we think, well, maybe they're really stupid and actually going to, let this powder keg sit on top of this powder keg for longer. And that's actually harder to imagine than the fact that they're smart real politicians.
And Christopher Dickey, if the army does want to crack down, can it do it?
It can probably do it if it's cracking down on the Brotherhood. It will be difficult because the Brotherhood's going to have a lot of people in the streets. But I think apropos of what Marcus was saying, I lived in Egypt for a long time, and my experience is that as stupid as the Egyptian leaders were, they were always a lot smarter about Egypt than I was. And they basically understood their country, guess what, a hell of a lot better than I understood it. I think that wasn't true with Mubarak at the end. But it may be true with both, ironically, with both the Brotherhood and the military right now. I think that there are games being played between them. I think some of those games are hard for us to analyze. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to see a lot of unrest, maybe not a violence, maybe not a cliche that's come up recently is that this is going to be like Algeria in 1991.
Or Turkey in the 80s.
Well, it may be more like Turkey in the 80s than Algeria in 91. Algeria in 91 launched a civil war that lasted for years and was really horrific. I don't think that's going to happen in Egypt. But we are going to face a lot of very difficult times.
The Economist in its lead editorial writes that between generals and Islamists, the West should back the latter, dismissing the argument that Egypt is too complex to influence in that editorial. It says, Marcus Mabry, the generals thrive on American aid and are plainly nervous about seizing untrammeled power. Now, here's an interesting development. Field Marshal Tantawi, last Friday, speaks on the telephone to the U.S. Defense Secretary. No mention made of the SCAF's plans to do some constitutional rewriting at that point. And there was this sharp statement that came out of Washington from the Pentagon expressing deep concern, urging the Army to hand over full power to civilians. But there was never any mention made of what the U.S. would actually do.
Right. Well, the Obama administration has been really kind of the epitome, I think to the chagrin of its supporters, of kind of a traditional American approach, which is, yes, we want change and democracy, but we want stability more. And Egypt is a fulcrum of American influence in that region. And so, yes, we do want, as the DOD said, we do want them to open up power and share it, but I really don't believe the statement that we want them to totally turn over power to the people of Egypt. I don't think Washington wants that.
Well, it's not turning over the power to the people, it's turning over power to the Brotherhood. It's not exactly the same thing.
Exactly.
I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the Army can play this game because even if he lost, the Army's candidate got about half the votes.
And can Washington play this game since they give $1.3 billion in aid?
Now, Washington's in a very difficult position. I mean, one of the things you need to know is that Tantawi hates the Americans. He never liked the Americans. He always thought that their influence was too great. So there's a very tense relationship. There's another guy, Sami Anand, Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces, who is the American guy in the SCAF. But it's a very complicated
Sometimes he doesn't want
mix.
that money to go away either, because
No, he's not going to go away. But I mean, the idea that we have this great friendly relationship with the Egyptian military just because we give them $1.3 billion a year is misleading. They are using us and we're using them. Everybody's using everybody in this political environment. And it's not a question of heartfelt alliances.
All right. And while the United States ponders whether or not it should be more proactive when it comes to Egypt, it seems like it's being certainly more proactive when it comes to Syria. The New York Times reported Thursday that a small number of CIA officers have been deployed to southern Turkey, where they were helping U.S. allies decide which Syrian opposition elements should receive weapons deliveries. This after a French publication, Intelligence Online, reported that the CIA Special Forces are already training the Free Syrian Army in Jordan. Which ones get weapons? Because, Stefan de Vries, there is this feeling that, on the one hand, they want to move this thing forward. The Russians aren't going to let anything happen in the Security Council. On the other hand, there is this awareness that there are Al-Qaeda elements in among that opposition in Syria.
Yeah, it's very hard to tell whom are we giving weapons to if we are doing that, because there are tens or maybe hundreds of organizations that present themselves as being the legitimate opposition, whereas we actually don't really know who they are. They are not really well organized, as for instance we saw in Libya, where there was a clear opposition and a clear, well, at least they got some good organization, especially in the beginning in the resistance against Gaddafi, but that's something that does not exist in Syria. And of course, the geopolitical situation is completely different because it's a very dangerous neighborhood. There's, of course, Lebanon next to Syria, where also there are a lot of tensions, always a lot of tensions, but especially the last couple of weeks, it starts to heat up again. So it's a very complex situation, and I was not surprised by the news that the CIA allegedly delivers weapons, because that's mainly their core business, to deliver weapons to anyone who wants in the world, as long as
That's a little over bit of a
one of the lines of business.
One of the lines of business. Very lucrative business. But the real question is, whom are we giving these weapons to?
And more specifically, the same Leon Panetta we were talking about a moment ago, the defense secretary, telling the Reuters news agency, I think it's fair to say we have a concern about the man-pads coming out of Libya, man-pads being those shoulder-held surface-to-air missiles.
Yeah.
So there is this sort of feeling.
Look, all you have to do is go back and look at the Afghan experience. Yes. That was tremendously successful, except for the aftermath, which gave us Al-Qaeda and all the things that we know have happened. And the whole war on terror basically started with guys from the terrorist side, with guys that we had trained and supported. I mean, we don't want to do that again. But this is,
and at least there was an excuse. It was against the Soviet Union. It was one of the great sort of hot elements of the Cold War, so to speak. So there was a reason. But here, it's not. There's not much of a reason to intervene, and there are so many reasons not to.
So many reasons not to, but at the same time, we see the level of killing on both sides spiking tremendously.
I
But
think
it doesn't mean that it's true. It's horrible, but it doesn't mean that it is wise to go and arm some people that you're not sure of, either motivations or where they come from, and to add this to the mix. I'm not sure it's the wise decision.
Well, I think the reporting so far doesn't tell us whether this is something that the CIA is doing because it just wants to get involved and find people to overthrow Assad. I hope they're not that stupid, because they're not going to be able to do that. Or whether this is defensive, where they figure if they're giving out some arms, at least that'll give them a little entree, and they can start to figure out who is doing what on the ground, which is something that very few people have figured out so far.
Now,
because otherwise it could all be too late, and they're actually things spiral of control with no break against the other side.
Killing is up in Syria, and it's spiking dramatically over the past couple of weeks. So are defections. 4 brothers, 2 brigadier generals, and 2 colonels announcing over the internet that they had defected from the army on Friday, one day after a Syrian Air Force pilot flew his MiG-21 fighter jet to neighboring Jordan. What's your sense, Stefan de Vries, when you look at the way this horrible conflict, which has been going on since March 2011, is panning out? What's changing?
Well, in my opinion, not a lot. Actually, I'm quite surprised about the fact that how loyal the army still is towards this horrible al-Assad. It's already 1 year and a half almost that this is going on, and nothing really changes on the ground. Only more people die. But Assad is still, well, it's very hard to judge, of course, because journalistic coverage from within Syria is very rare. So it's hard to say what is really going on. But as we watch it here, I think Assad is still very strong. He's still in place. He doesn't really blink his eye. He won't move, and the defections are basically very rare. That's, you talk about 4 brothers, 1 pilot on Thursday. Very limited number of defections.
If you see the whole garrison rebel, then I think that's the turning point in the war. But we haven't seen anything close to that. No. We've seen 2 or 3 people here, 2 or 3 people there.
We've seen some troops who had joined from the Syrian army who had joined the rebellion. We've seen some of those.
But I'm talking about a garrison that basically falls, where you have the majors or the colonels say, we are in rebellion, we stand against Assad, and our tanks will defend the revolution. When you see that, that's a major turning point, but we haven't seen anything close to that.
But is that about Alawite and kind of tribal loyalties and penetration within the armed forces? Is that why we're not seeing that kind of defection?
It's because the armed forces, the people who run the armed forces certainly, and a lot of the soldiers feel that their lives are on the line, that if things start to crack, if the regime starts to go down, they're dead meat. And,
and their families.
And their families. At the end of the day, that's why it's very hard to break into that, and nothing that the rebels are doing at this point, especially as they're armed and get more militant, is reassuring those people that won't be the case.
When we come back in the world this week, we're going to look also now at the countdown to the EU summit next week, crucial talks this Friday in Rome, and also Uruguay's novel way of dealing with its rising drug crime problem.